This is a graphic showing what in activation mapping looks like. So placing your ablation catheter, let's say it's site 1. So site 1 is this site here. So this is the ablation catheter, and you will detect an EGM. If the tachycardia is originating from up here, you'll detect an EGM that is occurring within the QRS onset. If this is our QRS here, then you go, okay, well, my ablation catheter is quite late relative to QRS onset, and so I'm going to move my ablation catheter up to this location, and then now I detect an EGM that is occurring on time with QRS onset, so I know my ablation catheter is closer to tachycardia origin than my previous site of mapping, but it's still not 20 milliseconds ahead of the QRS onset. So I know I'm not quite at the tachycardia origin. So I know that going higher or going in this direction is moving me closer to the tachycardia. So I'm going to move my ablation catheter even higher up now. And now my ventricular EGM should occur in the silent emanation period. So it should precede QRS onset. So that's excellent. And now we're at the point where we could start saying that maybe we're at the origin of tachycardia. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move my ablation catheter a little bit higher again to make sure that higher isn't even earlier than my current site. So I do that, I put it to site 4, and in site 4 now we get an EGM that's even earlier relative to QRS onset. So now we're getting really excited. This might be the spot that is the earliest location relative to QRS onset. This might be the tachycardia origin. But what I'll do is I'll just move my ablation catheter a little bit higher to this location, and I'll just make sure that higher isn't even better. So I move it to site 5, and it is even better. Site 5 is better than site 4, and I've got now 30 milliseconds ahead relative to QRS onset. So now I'm getting really excited. This is the kind of area where we'd expect tachycardia origin to be, with such an early ventricular EGM relative to QRS onset. So what I'll do is I'll just move my ablation catheter just a little bit higher again to make sure that even higher isn't even better. And so I move it to site 6. And site 6 still has an early EGM, but it's not quite as early as site 5. So this is what we term bracketed. We've bracketed the origin, because site 5 was early, and a little bit below was not as early, and a little bit above was not as early. So site 5 is the earliest site and represents tachycardia origin, and this is where we'll be ablating. And you can see on this map that we did ablate here. And this kind of dark circle represents the kind of region of myocardial muscle mass that we'd expect to encapsulate the silent emanation period, where we'd expect an early EGM relative to QRS onset. So just like focal atrial tachycardia, focal PVCs arising from any location should generally exhibit a unipolar QS wave if your catheter is right over the top of the PVC location. So if we imagine that we have an ablation catheter and we have a PVC origin that's occurring remote from our ablation catheter or mapping catheter, then that will result in a depolarization wavefront that moves towards our ablation electrode, and our unipolar signal will exhibit an R wave, because anything that moves towards an electrode in unipolar signals will be positive, anything that moves away from the electrode will be negative. So as the depolarization comes from the ventricular origin and moves towards the ablation electrode, it'll exhibit an R wave on the unipolar electrogram. And then as depolarization travels past our ablation catheter and moves away from our ablation catheter, then the unipolar signal will exhibit a large negative component on our electrogram. Now, if we imagine that we then move our ablation catheter right over the top of tachycardia origin, then all of the depolarization wavefront will be moving away from our ablation electrode, and that results in a unipolar QS pattern. And so unipolar QS patterns are consistent with the focal origin of a PVC. So if you have a bipolar electrogram that's early relative to QRS onset, and then you have a unipolar electrogram exhibiting a QS morphology, these are strong predictors of PVC origin and strong predictors that ablating in this location may achieve success.